everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be my full spoiler review of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. So this won't be a chronological breakdown of the film, but much more of a free-flowing discussion and outlining of the elements that I felt worked best, and the ones that didn't work quite as well within the movie itself. And you can also check out my non-spoiler review of the film, and I will leave a link within the description. So I will start this then with some of the most outstanding sequences throughout the entire film, and this centered around when Odysseus and his men went on their journey back home, fighting off all the various perils and dangers. And one of the most outstanding dangers itself was the Cyclops. We see this when Odysseus enters the cave, and I foolishly felt that this was a mistake from Odysseus to enter an environment where you only have one exit. But when we see the Cyclops appearing, it's very creepy, and the monster itself was very oddly misshapen, almost malnourished in very ways, and this added to its overall creepiness. And we know, if you watch the behind the scenes footage, that Christopher Nolan went, as he usually does, for a more practical construct within the Cyclops, as opposed to making it far more hulking and physically imposing. And I think in this sequence it worked very well. It was genuinely terrifying to see the Cyclops eating the soldiers almost in a nonchalant fashion, stomping on them as they were attempting multiple times to escape the cave. They had to wait because the Cyclops had to lift the rock in order to let the fleet of sheep leave, and they had to attempt multiple times. And also like the way that they had to tie haystacks to their back to make it seem that they were amongst the herd escaping from the cave. Now, I didn't agree with Odysseus' very silly decision to strike down the arrow at the Cyclops, as they blinded it first when they eventually escaped the cave. This antagonises it, and then we get a really frantic chase where we see the Cyclops halting them down as they try to escape to their ships. Now, we didn't get the iconic moments from the source material where Odysseus refers to himself as being nobody, and this is from the source material because when the Cyclops is hurt and it reports back to this other Cyclopses as to who damaged it, all it could say was nobody. They didn't have that line, nor did they have the moment when Odysseus reveals his identity, and this is what causes the Cyclops to reveal to Poseidon that it was indeed Odysseus who injured it, and then this is what motivates Poseidon to have Odysseus embark on a 10-year-long journey across the sea. But overall, this is a very good sequence, as was the second sequence where we see them encountering the hulking giants. This is when they go to the island known as Scion, and they take on the giants who are known as the Laestrygones. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. And we see the sequence build up when they first encounter a child who is in armor, and we see the child laughing and screaming, and then all of a sudden they become ambushed. And once more, it's very thrilling and genuinely scary as we see the soldiers fearing for their lives. We see many of them trapped and then striking down. Now, admittedly, the soldiers did look a bit clunky, and I think Nolan could have done much better in the overall aesthetical design of the soldiers. They seemed to move a lot slower than what the soldiers were in terms of running, so you had to disbelieve a little bit that the hulking giants could catch them. But overall, it was still a great moment, still a fantastic sequence. You could see that Nolan was adopting the same sequences that he had from his previous war movie, Dunkirk. It did have that feel of how the soldiers were storming the beach and then coming under attack. So it was a very good sequence in here also. We then go on to what was without doubt the most creepiest scene and the most disturbing sequence of the movie, and then this is when the soldiers encounter the witch, Circe, who lets them into their house, and this is when, of course, they are struggling for supplies. And that was a running theme throughout the entire film, how the soldiers were going from various locations and they were continually running out of food, and this added to the despair and the desperation and the urgency throughout these sequences where we see them on the way home. And when they encounter Circe, she's very welcoming. She lets them into the house, and we see them stuffing themselves full of food. And then we come to, again, the most distressing moments where we see Circe transforming them into pigs, where we see her rubbing their heads slowly, and like a sculpture is moulding clay. When we see Circe changing their faces and we see them morphing into pigs, and I liked the juxtaposition between this sequence and Odysseus, who was out on the field hunting a deer, and as he's hunting the deer he sees the empty armor plates on the floor, and that's where it was really ramping up the tension. And as a viewer, you're wondering what exactly is going on here, and then you shortly realize that there were soldiers that had arrived here before, and Circe had turned them into various beasts and monsters, and that's when we were looking at the lion and the zebra as well. So it was a masterful sequence, and once more very freaky. And I remarked in my non-spoiler review as to how the actress Samantha Morton really shined in this moment here, just giving that freakiness and edginess. A bit similar to what we saw in her performance in The Walking Dead, where she played the character known as Alpha, but was a fantastic moment and really ramped up the more horror elements. And I think this is what has eluded a lot of people to feeling that Christopher Nolan could indeed direct a horror movie. I'm not so sure, but we will wait and see. But definitely these scenes overall were very expertly directed. We go on to the fourth sequence, and this is when Odysseus went to the Hades, the Underworld. Now, this was when he was seeing the various shades, as what they called it, of previous soldiers under his command, previous people that he had interacted with, and this was very much, if you like, the ghost representations of them. Now, Nolan shot this with a very dark filter and a very open field, and I think it was very effective, where we see the soldiers arriving in Hades, and then we see the shades of different people rise up from the ground, literally, and we see them covered all in dirt. And this is when he talked to Scion, who was played by Eliot Page, and we had a very reflective moment when Scion revealed that he was betrayed by Odysseus because he was used as a decoy in many ways, as a deserter, when we referred to the fact that the Trojans discovered the wooden horse on the beach, and Scion was used as somebody who genuinely believed that the Greek soldiers were lost. So when they interrogated him, his reaction had to be genuine. There could be no doubt as to him believing that the soldiers had fallen, otherwise they would have indeed investigated and opened up the horse itself. So very well done. And then we had the other shade of Agamemnon, and this is when we get the backstory between him and Melanesis and Helen and her sister or half-sister Clytemnestra also. And that was a side story which I'll refer to in a minute, that I think this film didn't really need to go into. But the whole aesthetic and the whole creepiness again of the Hades Underworld was done very well and very dark, again given that real brooding atmosphere that was really running a lot throughout most of the movie itself. So very well executed sequence here. Another stunning sequence was what we saw within the trailer when we see the soldiers encounter the Whirlpool. This is, I believe, when they encounter the location known as the Sharbadis, when initially Odysseus tells the soldiers that you cannot encounter the Whirlpool because it would mean they were all resulting in their deaths, and the men to choose to take this decision anyway. And this was a running theme throughout this segment when the men were literally mutinying against Odysseus. They weren't agreeing with a lot of his decisions. They felt that his decisions were costing them a lot of their lives, and they were initially going to leave him on the island. And when they encounter the Whirlpool again, you have that striking visual we saw in the trailers, very great to see. But then we had a truly stunning moment when they escaped the Whirlpool, but then all of a sudden they're being attacked by the monster within the cliffs. And this sequence reminded me a little bit of the Kraken scene within Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest, where we had a similar monster attacking the people on the ship from the air and also from the water. Now, Nolan held back a lot in terms of the overall design because, as we all know, he tries to ground this a lot in realism as much as possible. So we didn't really see the beast in its fuller form. We saw much more of the tentacles releasing from the cave itself, but it was still a very effective moment and definitely made me jump multiple times when watching it on the big screen. So again, all of these sequences here were absolutely fantastic, the best moments within the entire film, and I really wish that Nolan had focused the first half of the movie entirely on the journey itself, instead of jumping back and forth in time, which I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, really disrupted the pace and momentum of the movie itself. We then talk about the encounter with Calypso, and this is following when Odysseus' men arrive on another island, and he warns them not to touch the cattle that are on the island, as the shade of Tiresias told Odysseus that they would die if they did this. And initially they resist it. They'd been on the island for many months, I believe, but eventually they succumb to their hunger and they slaughter the cattle, and this will result in their death. But again, due to the way that Nolan had a very jumbled telling of the story, we don't get this in a linear approach. We see first, multiple times, Odysseus on the island with Calypso, recounting the events, losing his memories. He was being kept there by Calypso because he was eating the lotus flowers, and they were back and forth. But it was a good reveal when eventually Odysseus realizes that this is not the reality that he believes it to be. And then we had that very fraught sequence where we see the soldiers being attacked by Zeus, I believe, on the ship. We see the waves crashing against the ship itself, and it was done in a very realistic way. You don't really see a lot of the lightning, as you wouldn't in that particular sequence if you're filming it in a realistic perspective. So it was very well done. And then we had the heathen glow, if you like, of seeing Calypso together with Odysseus. And I think the film could have done a bit more to see how Calypso exactly attracted Odysseus to this moment. If you go by the source material, Calypso is a nymph, so she should have used in some way, shape or form her more sexual desires to entrance Odysseus on this island. This referenced back to the Song of the Sirens, where we saw how the soldiers had to cover their ears in wax so they wouldn't hear the songs of the sirens as they passed that island. And Nolan held back in terms of the sexuality and the sexual temptation of the women on the island. It was very funny how one of the soldiers took the wax out of his ears and frantically swam to the shore in order to arrive in the island of paradise. That was a very funny moment, intentionally or not. It was a very good scene to see Odysseus in anguish and in pain, hearing the siren of the songs as they were swimming past it. So again, that was very well done, and at the same time, the chemistry between Charlize Theron, who played Calypso, and Matt Damon wasn't quite emphasised enough. I mean, don't get me wrong, casting Charlize Theron as Calypso was very apt because it's Charlize Theron. But I don't think enough was done here in this particular sequence. And I think the impact was taken away because, again, Nolan kept jumping back and forth. We were introduced to Calypso very early on within the film. So I think, again, that took away the various impact of that particular character. I will then talk about the Battle of Troy, which I think was used constantly throughout this movie. As we all know from the original source material, the events of the Odyssey take place after the Trojan War. But this movie here kept using the Trojan War as a reference point. Nolan again kept jumping back and forth. We saw the Trojan War displayed multiple times in flashback, and I have to be honest, I think it was overused too many times. We had the first sequence where they were preparing for war. We had the whole development of the soldiers lying in the Trojan horse, and we see them covered in the water and the heat and their own excrement and multiple times as they were there for multiple days. And this is a fine example of where Christopher Nolan was tapping much more into the realism rather than the fantasy. Now, yes, we could argue realistically a wooden horse left on the beach would get submerged in the water, and yes, when they discover it, they would struggle more to lift it or carry it out of the beach onto the Trojan gates. And yes, the soldiers would be cramped and suffocate very much so being in that wooden horse. But I think in that sequence, it removed the fantasy and it was a bit frustrating and a bit laughable. Now, other movies, if we look at the 2004 Wolfgang Peterson Troy, the horse was constructed far better and it was upright. So you could believe much more that the Trojans could take the horse to the Trojan gates. But when you see it here carried in this very awkward fashion, you did think there's no way that the horse would be able to maintain its shape. The way that they were carrying it along the wooden rollers, that horse construct would eventually break, and you would smell, especially the odour of the shoulders. And they even stabbed the horse once or twice. They would have realised that there were shoulders in there. So yeah, I think that was a prime example of where Nolan, choosing the realism, didn't follow through in terms of overall logic. But the Trojan War itself was really the crux in terms of the whole consciousness of Odysseus. The character used the Trojan War as a way to burden his own consciousness. We saw this towards the climatic sequences when he arrives back in Ithaca and he talks to Penelope in that extended montage. This is when he's aged a lot more, and he used the Trojan War as a sense of remorse, as a sense of regret, and that was really fueling his motivation to save his men and get back home. And this was tying into the overall forbidden law of Zeus, where you have to welcome your guests into your house because you don't know whether they could be just normal human beings or godlike beings themselves. So they would juxtaposition that with the fact that with the wooden horse, you were coming under the guise of guests and having the Trojans letting themselves into your house and then taking it down, and that was in a way going against the laws of Zeus. I didn't quite buy that because the wooden horse is a strategic command in many ways. You were using that disguise to infiltrate the building and the gates of Troy. So you were never going in there to be a guest. So that's why I think it was something flawed in terms of the concept that Christopher Nolan was trying to build. But in terms of the context, I think it did work and it was handled very well. And I think it added depth and weight to Odysseus as a character himself. And the performance from Matt Damon really convinced you that this was indeed somebody who wanted to make sure that his men went back home, and this was somebody who really was striving to find some sort of atonement for his previous sins and his previous misdemeanors. So that, in that sense, I think the Trojan conflict worked. But as I said, I think it was overused because we get the constant flashbacks, and as I mentioned in that extended prologue conversation with Penepole, we go over the Trojan sequence again, and we'd already done this 2 or 3 times before. So I think it took away the impact, especially when you realise that the Trojan War isn't part of the Odyssey story itself. And I truly believe that Nolan should have started in a more linear fashion, and he should have indeed began the movie with the Trojan conflict itself. We will then talk about the Ithaca section of the film, which I think was the more, or the less compelling part of the story. And in particular, we look at Robert Pattison's character, who was kind of the main villain of the piece, playing a character known as Antinoüs, who was one of the main suitors trying to gain Penelople's hand in marriage. And I think Robert Pattison is a very competent actor, but I wasn't convinced in this role here. The villain of the piece, if you like, came across as very wimpy overall. A lot of the times he was getting other soldiers to try and do his work. I actually felt that Corey Hawkins, who played much more of his fellow soldier in place, had far more figure, far more intensity in terms of the overall villain, and I think he would have been served far more better as the primary antagonist. I just didn't really feel that Pattison carried enough of an imposing presence, and this was shown very much more in a climactic act as we see Odysseus fighting off all of the other suitors, and Pattison isn't really getting involved in the conflict. He's just asking other soldiers to do it. So again, this took away a lot of the menacing presence of him in general. Other characters involved, I thought Anne Hathaway as Penelope was very strong. A woman who was burdened by the presence of having to maintain a kingdom, despite knowing the facts that all of the suitors were after her presence in marriage, not because they were necessarily attracted to her, but more so because they just wanted a claim on the kingdom. There were very good scenes between her and Telemachus, in terms of the fact that Telemachus wanted to rise and become ruler of the kingdom, but Penelope still was clinging on hope. Firstly, because Odysseus could come home one day, but also of the fact that she felt that she deserved more because she had been holding the fort, if you like, for so many years. So she didn't really want to be discarded so much in terms of having a claim on the kingdom. We talk quickly of Telemachus, and I said in my non-spoiler review I felt that Tom Holland was perhaps miscast, but when we talk of the character, we talk more of his side quest, and this is when we see him venturing out to Sparta to search for his father, and this is when we had other characters, very much so from the Trojan War story, being brought into play. This is where we see Telemachus interact with King Menelaus, who was the husband of Helen, and this is many years after the Trojan story where he managed to reclaim Helen back, and this is where Telemachus was looking for any information regarding Odysseus, and we see Menelaus telling his own story of what he knew about Odysseus, and this is when once more we were getting the various flashbacks towards the Trojan War. And I just think this side quest really took a lot of the pace and momentum away from the story. I understand it's the source material, but I think you have to show a priority in terms of what's most important in the storytelling, and I think this whole side quest could have been completely taken out. We didn't really need to see if Telemachus could get any more information from Menelaus or Helen. We had the whole backstory regarding Helen and her sister Clytemnestra, and how she got her revenge on Agamemnon, who sacrificed their daughter in order to win the goddess favour of Artemis. And yes, this is embracing the source material, but again, it wasn't needed. It took a good 25 minutes of the film, and I think you could have taken it out completely. You could have just had Telemachus go on a search. You could have made maybe 1 or 2 scenes and then have him come back to the story. And the fact that none of these characters were integral in the overall climax of the film, again, showed that they weren't really necessarily important to the overall story. So following on that, then we will touch base on all of the castings that caused on the controversy. This is involving Elliot Page's role as Scion, Lupita Nyong'o's role as Helen of Troy, and Travis Scott's role as the bard in the beginning of the movie telling the various events. And for all of the outrage and all of the controversy online, it turned out it was completely unnecessary, because all of these castings had probably combined screen time of around maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And especially when we look at Helen of Troy, it was again unnecessary. When we look at how uninvolved these characters were, particularly Helen of Troy, when we see her involved, this is post the events where Menelaus has recovered her, and we see that she's scarred. And this is the fact that King Menelaus got revenge on her for having an affair with Paris. It just emphasised the fact that Lupita's casting was just stunt casting, nothing more, just to claim diversity points and also to create a lot of rage bait and outrage online. And once more, to see Helen of Troy disfigured was really telling, I felt, in the fact that Christopher Nolan went to cast an African American woman, and the fact that you were casting her as Helen of Troy, but you couldn't have her be the beautiful, stunning Helen of Troy that we all know from the story. No, you had to show her as somebody who was disfigured. So I think that was something very telling, and it's probably a worthwhile discussion. Now, Elliot Page's role as Scion was more integral and more impactful, as I described earlier on. The fact that we tied this to Odysseus's guilt, in the fact that he manipulated Scion into being the deserter or the distraction. We had the backstory, of course, of Robert Pattison's character being denied enlisting into the war effort, and it was Scion that took his place, and that he held back because Odysseus felt that he was older and more responsible in order to look after the rest of his family and also his own son Telemachus as well. And this tied to the guilt that Odysseus felt. So Scion, in terms of Elliot Page, who was perfectly fine in the role in terms of the performance, was far more integral than what, let's say, Lupita was, and I think that was far less a disappointing choice in terms of the overall casting. But as I mentioned before, all of the outrage over the casting was completely irrelevant because they just weren't that integral to the overall story. We will then focus on Zendaya's role as Athena. In terms of her performance, I felt it was standard, a bit bland, nothing too special, but they did tie the character much more into, again, the guilt of Odysseus, because when we get the climatic reveal referencing back to the Battle of Troy once more, this is where we see that the portrayal of Athena by Zendaya was tied into the fact that during the conquest of Troy, Odysseus saw somebody who looked like Zendaya being beheaded, and that was crossed with the statue of Athena being beheaded as well. So there was this interesting dilemma as to whether the manifestation of Athena, was it the actual goddess herself, or was it the representation of the young girl who was beheaded by the very soldiers? And again, that was another visualization of Odysseus's guilt, that was something that he was carried right throughout the movie. That was a symbolism of his atonement that he was striving for throughout the entire story. So we then go on to the movie's ending, and this is where we see Odysseus coming back to the kingdom in the guise of a beggar, because he was aged from the several years being spent with Calypso. And we had that moment where Telemachus eventually realizes who he is, when Odysseus takes care of the dog that was put into his care at the beginning of the story. And this is when both of father and son were devising the best way in order to eliminate the suitors without referring to violence. Now that plan eventually didn't come into play, because once we had that sequence when Odysseus proves who he is, when he takes the bow and he strings the arrow through the 12 axes, and then this causes all of the bedlam, and this is when we get a very frantic sequence, the action climax of seeing Odysseus fighting off all the suitors. You had to suspend disbelief a little bit, that all of a sudden Odysseus becomes this unbeatable fighter, and he's fighting at least 40 or 50 people in a closed environment single-handedly. So that was a bit of a stretch, but it did heighten the overall climax of the film. Now, somebody may question, why didn't Telemachus get involved? But that was because Odysseus didn't want Telemachus to break Zeus's law in terms of being a guest and then causing violence in the household of the host, because again, that breaks the forbidden law. So that's why Telemachus didn't really get involved. But it was a sound resolution as we see Odysseus reunited with Penepole, And it was a very good moment where we see them together, and I think the film did provide enough of an emotional context in terms of earlier scenes between both Penelope and Odysseus. So when they reunite once more in this moment, it did carry a certain emotional weight. And it was a nice ending to see both of them go into exile, because that was the punishment of Odysseus having caused or participated in the violence of the house. He had to go into exile and went with him, as we see Telemachus become the new ruler of the kingdom, and we see them sailing off into the sunset. And that was very nicely done, and in a way I'm glad that Nolan decided not to kill Odysseus off, as is so often the case in a lot of these modern day historical epics where we have to have the tragic heroic death. It was very nice to see him reunite with Penelope and they rise off into the sunset, and we had the final scene of the horse burning. Again, I think Nolan is trying to complete that story of atonement, that is Odysseus washing away his guilt for his past sins and going into forgiveness and happiness. So that was a very rounded resolution overall to the movie itself. So that's my overall very long spoiler review of the Odyssey. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you have any other further movies, television series, or any other topics with the pop entertainment and culture scene they'd like to see me cover within the channel, then also let me know in the comments, and I will see if I can provide further commentary for you on that subject matter within the future. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very, very soon.